Thank you, Congressman Brat. Appreciate you shedding light. You know, this administration from the very beginning went a long way in promising transparency and accountability. In fact, it was President Obama himself who expressed, and I quote, "My administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government." In the same speech, he went on to say, once again as President Obama, "Transparency promotes accountability and provides information for citizens about what their government is doing. Information maintained by the federal government is a national asset." President Obama said, "My administration will take appropriate action consistent with law and policy to disclose information rapidly in forms that the public can readily find and use." Well, that's what he said, but it's been the exact opposite for the Department of Justice. Much of us have heard about Fast and Furious, and we may have time to get to it. What I want to talk about tonight is Operation Choke Point. I'm here to do that tonight as one of the strong conservatives in all of Congress, my colleague from South Carolina, Mr. Mick Mulvaney.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. Thank him for doing this. I think it's wonderful that we're having a night designated as the People's Night. You would think that we would do that just about every day in here, but I think that more often than not we probably don't. So it's good to be here to talk about things that affect the people. And some things that affect the people, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker, back where I live, is Operation Choke Point. Where I live, people buy guns at gun shows. They use pawn shops. They might go to a payday lender every now and then. They might go and buy ammunition. And because of what's happened at Operation Choke Point the last year and a half or so, they're starting to lose the ability to do that. I want to explain to people very briefly what Operation Choke Point is, and acknowledge to me, this is not some right-wing conspiracy, it's not some internet myth. This has been acknowledged by the Department of Justice. That several years ago, the DOJ, along with the FDIC, one of the banking regulators, set out to attack legal businesses. Businesses that were perfectly legal and permitted under the law, but they were in disfavor with this administration. And instead of trying to drive those businesses out of business by using the law, this administration decided to use the regulatory environment. And instead of going directly after those businesses, this administration went after their banks and said, look, you know, we know that this pawn shop is a legal business, and we know that you've done business with them for a long time, but we could really make your life difficult if you continue to bank this particular pawn shop. In fact, your life would be much easier if you didn't bank this pawn shop. And time and again, Mr. Speaker, what we found was these small businesses, a woman-owned business in my district, losing their banking relationships. The banks that had 25-year relationships with them would come to them and say, look, we just simply can't bank you anymore. It's too difficult to do. We're under too much pressure to stop. I had a woman-owned business pawn shop in my district. She tried to expand the business so that the business was big enough to give to both of her sons. She was a single mother. She wanted to get the business big enough to where both boys could inherit part of the business. She went to her local bank where she had more than a 20-year relationship, and she was told no, that she was now too hot to handle. They could not continue to, not only could they not give her a loan to expand the business, they had to pull back on the services that they already provided. Got another business elsewhere in the state, large financial concern. A little tiny piece of what they do is payday lending. And say what you want to about it, Mr. Speaker. You may not like payday lending. A lot of people don't, but people use it. People need it. I'll never forget when I was in the state legislature, we had a hearing on payday lending, and one of the witnesses that spoke before me in the Senate was an employee of one of the local credit unions, and I knew who she was. And I walked up to her afterwards and I said, you're here to talk in favor of payday lending? And she said, yeah. And I said, you know, but you work for a credit union. She says, yeah. And I said, why are you here? And she said, because everybody in town knows who I am. And I'm having a tough divorce. And I need a little bit of money. And if I go to my local bank or I go to my credit union where I work, everybody's going to know about it. I don't want people to know my business. She needed that particular service. Folks need this service. It may not be the proudest thing that we do as a nation, but people need it. And this company in Greenville, South Carolina, had a little tiny piece of their business in Payday, a 30-year banking relationship for all the rest of their businesses. And the bank came to them one day and said, look, we're under a great deal of pressure. We're going to have to pull all of our relationships with you. Maybe 2.5% of their business was Payday. And now this large employer in my district is struggling to find financial services. It's so offensive, Mr. Speaker, that a couple months ago, the DOJ finally acknowledged that it was wrong, and they agreed to stop the program. The FDIC agreed to stop as well. All I can tell you is, while the letter went out saying it was stopped, we're still hearing stories to this day that it's still going on. My dad told me about a year ago, I'd been here 3 years at the time, and he'd sort of started paying attention to politics after I got here. He said, you want to know the difference, Mick, between government today and government when I was your age? And I said, what's that, Dad? He said, when I was your age, you know, you might not like what the government did, you might not like the party that was in power, but it never even occurred to us to be afraid of the government. It never even occurred to us that we might be targeted for what we believe or what we think or what we do for a living. He says, that's what's different now. People are afraid of their government. And if you're home tonight, you're watching this, and you run an ammunition store in Union, South Carolina, you're legitimately afraid that the government is going to try and come and put you out of business. And that's a dramatic change, Mr. Speaker, and not a change for the better. And to the extent that a group of men and women who come here tonight at the invitation of the good gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, can come and just tell people that we think it's wrong too, and we've heard what they've had to say back home, and just to deliver the message that they are not alone, that there are some men and women here in Washington who are just as outraged as they are, and are dedicated to making sure that when our time here is done, they won't have to fear their government anymore. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank the gentleman from North Carolina again for setting up this hearing.
What's Doug got? For what purpose?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report for the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 315, resolution providing for consideration of the bill, H.R. 2596, to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2016 for intelligence and intelligence-related activities of the United States government, the Community Management Account, and the Central Intelligence Agency Retirement and Disability System, and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We talk about accountability. Think of great leaders here in the Congress, even people who have reached out as mentors, and can think of no one higher than has that honor for my respect than the colleague, part of our delegation in North Carolina, Mr. Mark Meadows. With that, I yield time to him.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for his leadership and truly for being willing to be the voice of the American people. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to really highlight what so many Americans have a hard time understanding, and that is why we as the American people can continue to allow a government to overreach its true authority and not be reined in, Mr. Speaker. And so tonight I want to highlight just a few things, but before I do that, I think it's important that we talk about the federal workers here that work for the American people, the vast majority of which, I would say almost 99% of which, are dedicated public servants who each and every day give their utmost for their fellow man, truly to serve this great country. And so tonight, Mr. Speaker, I rise to really highlight some of those that give the rest of those great federal workers a bad name. And for many of us, they also give us a reason to pause and say, wait just a minute, how can that happen in this great land? So tonight, I feel like it's important that we identify some of these workers who truly have displaced the trust of the American people. They've taken federal tax dollars, they've continued to take a salary, and yet what we find is they did not uphold their constitutional duty to do what is right on behalf of the American people. We know one example is with the EPA, the gentleman who worked to define the Clean Air Act. We found that over time that he was not even showing up for work, that he would continue to be paid for years and years and years that he was paid without showing up. Now, certainly his colleagues would have to know that there was an empty cubicle next to them. But yet for over a decade, we have an EPA employee who pretended to be a CIA agent. Now, when we start to look at this, is here he was not showing up for work. He was traveling all over the world at taxpayers' expense. Indeed, what he was continuing to do is pretend like he was an employee of the federal government, but not showing up. So my question is really more about accountability, Mr. Speaker. Where was the management team? Where was the accountability? We can understand one bad apple, but where was the management? Well, let me tell you where they were. This particular EPA employee decides that they're going to go and they're going to retire. And so all the management comes together. They give him a great retirement party. He retires and he says, but wait just a minute, you need to continue to pay me because I'm still working for the CIA. Now, the sad part about it is they continued to pay him for another 18 months. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but that is just hard to believe. It's the things that novels are made of, but yet this is not fictitious. It's the truth. We've got other EPA employees that are there that are watching porn on their government computer over 6 hours a day for 4 years. Where's the oversight there? And yet when people are willing to blow the whistle and say this is not right with some of my colleagues, what do they meet with? Well, we heard at a hearing just this last week that a whistleblower for the Department of Homeland Security and their EB-5 program was punished because she dared to speak up. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's time that the American people start to hold the management of federal workers accountable because they are entrusted with that trust that needs to be carried out each and every day. And so tonight I'm here to call out Mr. Mayorkas, who recently an IG report identified Mr. Mayorkas as doing special favors for political operatives. Allegedly, the governor of Virginia, allegedly the brother of our former Secretary of State. What the American people will not stand for, Mr. Speaker, is a double standard. If political favors are going to be given out, the people who give them out should be held accountable. And I appreciate the gentleman from North Carolina, his leadership, because not only is his service on oversight and government reform designed to make sure that we get to the truth of it, but he is unrelenting in his willingness to go after those who live by a double standard. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back and I thank the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Congressman Meadows. Appreciate your words tonight. A lot of interest these days in the growing list of candidates that we have running for the 2016 presidential election. And one of the things that drove me to make a decision in running for Congress to begin with was the great abuses that we have in some of the particular agencies. 3 years ago, none were more glaring than the State Department and the actions taken by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. To this day, I can't understand why she could look and even hug a family and tell them point blank that this was about a video. 9 days later, our president followed up with pretty much the same inaccurate jargon. My friend tonight, who's going to talk some about her work and her time, is a great conservative from the state of Colorado. My privilege to yield time to Representative Ken Buck.
I thank the gentleman and my friend from North Carolina for putting this together and for recognizing me. Many of us know that today marks an important anniversary in world history. 800 years ago, following a populist revolution led by courageous English barons demanding the protections from executive overreach, England's King John signed into law a document known as the Magna Carta. This grand charter marked the first time that everyone, including kings, were subjected to the rule of law, that everyone would enjoy the benefits of due process and equal protection under the law. The Magna Carta inspired our founding fathers to demand liberty in the Declaration of Independence. Many Magna Carta principles appeared again in the United States Constitution. This one single document became the basis of our republic and established one of our greatest founding principles, the rule of law. And the rule of law remains as important as ever. President Obama is working to fundamentally transform our laws without consent, granting citizenship to legal immigrants, making recess appointments to the NLRB when the Senate is not in recess, and changing the health care law without an act of Congress. The IRS ignored the rule of law by targeting and harassing individuals based on their political beliefs. And who can forget the ATF's Fast and Furious program, which allowed U.S. weapons to be walked across the U.S.-Mexico border in hopes of catching Mexican drug lords, but ended with the tragic murder of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. It is time to prevent future would-be monarchs from being elected and further eroding our proud tradition for the rule of law. While the Clinton family has been known to play by their own set of rules and has a laundry list of scandals that go back decades, I am squarely focused on two dubious, dishonest, and dangerous scandals that Hillary Clinton was involved in while serving as Secretary of State. As the nation's top diplomat, Secretary Clinton used her position of power to create her own set of rules, using a personal email account for official State Department business. She continued to do so even after issuing a memo calling on staff to use official government email accounts. Secretary Clinton ignored the rule of law when she deleted over 30,000 State Department emails from a personal server located in the basement of her Georgetown mansion. What makes this worse is that she deleted these emails even as Congress called for her to release them. Storing these emails on a private server violates federal records law. Deleting these emails also raises questions not seen since the IRS targeting investigation. What is she hiding in these deleted emails? Did she even consider what might happen if these records fell into the wrong hands? Would she even know if her server had been breached? Secretary Clinton proudly stated during a March 10th press conference, "I fully complied with every rule I was governed by." Americans will never know because she ignored the rule of law. By exclusively using a personal email account to conduct State Department business, Secretary Clinton put the State Department at a great risk just for her personal convenience. The Secretary of State is also not allowed to conduct and store official State Department business on a private, unsecured server. If any other hardworking American conducted their business this way, they would be out of a job and most likely in jail. This brings me to the Clinton family's next scandal. While Hillary Clinton served as Secretary of State, the Clinton Family Foundation continued to accept millions of dollars in donations from foreign governments. All told, 7 foreign nations, including Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Algeria, donated money to the Clinton Foundation during the time Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. These contributions raised questions about Secretary Clinton's independence and ethical judgment. But when some of the $1 million donations in question came from nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman, it raises concerns about whether these nations were hoping to gain better diplomatic ties to the United States through sizable donations to the Clinton Foundation. When the Secretary of State is playing fast and loose with the rule of law, even ignoring a memorandum of understanding with the White House, regarding a questionable donation from the Algerian government, it is extremely difficult to trust her judgment or her word when she claims not to have broken any laws. The rule of law has been a core principle since our founding. Brave men and women have fought and died to protect this idea and preserve the liberty we hold so dearly. This is why I find it especially tragic that Secretary Clinton blatantly ignored the rule of law. The Magna Carta's anniversary is a great opportunity to remember the courageous barons who secured the rule of law. We must restore this key principle and stop the attacks on our founding principles. It is our job to safeguard those liberties and protect the America we know and love for generations to come. I yield back.
With that, it's my privilege